Back in 2006, during its 10th season, South Park aired one of its most popular episodes, Cartoon Wars Part 1. For those of you unfamiliar, this episode targets the successful animated series Family Guy and its over-reliance on pulp culture and non-sequiturs. Not exactly an original take, but criticism I've always found a bit hypocritical. Fact is, back in the late 90s, South Park developed biting satires like Robot Barbra Streisand and The Island of Dr. Monroe with Butts. But it wasn't these riveting concepts that skyrocketed the show into national prominence. Rather, the crude paper-style animation was unlike anything seen by a wide audience in the pre-internet age. But in reality, it was best known for two things: swearing children and the reoccurring death of Kenny. Despite this, the writing gradually became stronger, focusing on hyper-relevant news topics, all thanks to a growing budget and advancing technology that allowed episodes to be produced in just under 6 days. Now, if I'm being completely honest, my feelings on South Park have been mixed since it debuted back in 1997. While I'm impressed by the technique to turn around production in less than a week, I've seen the writing suffer over the years. From the original foul and funny to today's, well, knee-jerk hot takes that demonize sensationalism through sensationalism. That's not to say I dislike the show's creators, Matt Stone and Trey Parker. I just believe their fast-paced method does their comedic styles a disservice. Whenever they take longer than a week to write a script, they tend to put out better work, such as Team America, The Book of Mormon, and most importantly to this video, the well-received 2014 video game The Stick of Truth. For me, it was a breath of fresh air for the series. South Park finally felt focused again, and if I had to guess, this is likely due to working within a new medium. Yeah, there had been South Park games before, cheap cash-ins with half-baked premises, references, and the voice cast from the show. I should know, I bought those games. By the way, there was actually a really good pinball machine in the late 90s, totally underrated. But The Stick of Truth was the first time the creators helped build a game from the ground up. And just as South Park had pushed against the television standards of parental guidelines, now it would challenge the ESRB's rating system. Sure, the turn-based gameplay was a bit too simplistic, and the numerous loading screens dragged the pacing down, but South Park had successfully parodied video games by making a good video game. And that's because it followed the basic 3-act formula of the television show. The children are playing an innocent game of Dungeons & Dragons that somehow tricks the US military into believing a stupid twig is a magical relic. It's a silly idea that escalates into rampant destruction and death with plenty of obscene, gross, and disturbing events along the way, which is all brought about by people's general stupidity and unwillingness to listen. Now, 3 years later, we have a direct sequel, which is a first for Stone and Parker, The Fractured But Whole. That's but with one T and whole with a W. Swapping fantasy for superheroes with much stronger mechanics, a longer story, and far more nods to the 2-decade-old canon. So why does it feel lesser than the original? Well, we're gonna get to that in just a moment, but heads up, we will be discussing spoilers. So if you'd rather not know, go play the game and then come back. Or don't, I don't really care. Now before we get to the negatives, I want to say The Fractured But Whole is fine. Just fine. Honestly, it coasts off the charm of seeing authentic South Park art and locations. Actually, a lot of the locations are recycled from The Stick of Truth, but still, it's a perfect adaptation of the animation in a playable format. Though one slight nitpick, the frame rate is actually higher than the show's. The real improvement comes from the revamped combat, ditching the rigid turn-based system for a strategy RPG, complete with characters positioning on a grid, allowing players to pull off advanced strategies and attacks such as pushing an enemy into an ally for extra damage. Each maneuver covers a certain section of the battlefield, with some spreading out over vertical or horizontal rows to hit multiple opponents, while other more powerful attacks only work within a single horizontal square. Allies feature their own unique advantages in terms of range, with attacks increasing their effectiveness with properly timed button presses. On the defensive side, there are new meter-building recoveries. After receiving a hit, heroes are given a brief window to collect energy for their ultimate attacks. These are worth using just for the cinematic cutscenes alone. Status effects also make their return, with characters receiving burning, grossed out, and bleeding damage after a turn. These pretty much occur in every battle, as each attack features some sort of elemental attribute, and yes, there's a slight learning curve, with some enemy types being invulnerable to certain effects, but since they all do the exact same thing, they tend to blur together. As for the classes, there's really no weak link, as all are unlocked before the last stretch. Even if the techniques are nearly identical, it's exciting to have a sliver of variety later on. Health regenerates after every battle, so it's never all that difficult, which I think is the right design choice. After all, this is a comedy, and the gameplay is meant to take a back seat to the jokes. And that's really the gameplay in a nutshell. Simple. The progression system unlocks a series of slots, and placing in found or crafted items dictates the entire party's level, so there's no need to grind. Just explore every room and look for golden-colored lids and handles. The items give slight boosts to certain attacks, but for the most part, I just crafted the highest numbers and slotted them right in. By the last few hours, I was so overpowered, I began avoiding open-world encounters altogether. Most of the fun comes from just walking around town and searching for secrets like Tweak and Craig Hentai, or snapping selfies with the gigantic cast and building your followers on Instagram, or reaching higher ground around using fartcore, that's parkour with farts, or farting Captain Diabetes into a hulking rage to knock down obstacles. Look, a lot of the puzzles involve farting, it's your character's superpower. Every bit of gameplay is straight to the point, easy to accomplish, and features the series' signature humor and voice cast. This is all so players can just sit back and enjoy the story. There's only one problem. The story and many of its biggest jokes are kind of cute at best, or cheaply provocative at worst. You might assume based on the marketing that this is South Park's take on the superhero craze, considering every character has taken up an alter ego. But no, besides the obvious Civil War comparisons of two competing superhero teams, there's no long-term references to the films or comic books of the genre. In fact, the kids are more obsessed with starting a film franchise with multiple phases than being defenders of justice. A clever twist to be sure, but one that really can't sustain a dozen plus hours. And if anything, deflates the motivation of the player as it goes on. And this is the real problem of the Fractured But Whole, and in many cases, modern South Park. It brings up a lot of topics, especially sensitive subjects, and proceeds to say nothing. Just nothing. For instance, the first major setup is in character creation. After selecting the new kid style, players are sent to the difficulty screen, with a pale white skin labeled as easy and dark skin labeled as very difficult. Shocking? Sure. Funny? I'm not so certain. It's worth knowing this has no effect on the story, at least from what I played. But what's the punchline? Are we meant to think this is a statement about white privilege, the statistically proven benefits and attitudes received by lighter-skinned people through institutional racism? Yeah, that's what I assume. And if you're saying, who cares, it's about white privilege, it's an anti-racist joke. It doesn't even affect the game. Remember, the audience doesn't know that. This is viewed as a difficulty setting. Cartman even remarks it won't affect combat but every other aspect of your life. So even with the best intentions, this setup, as is discouraging players from creating a character with darker skin. I realize that this is a lot of focus on a very small part, but this fumbled execution is repeated over and over again. There's actually a lot of sections devoted to picking and defining your character's race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexuality, and religion during the rest of the story. And each time, at least in my playthrough, a gang of cartoonish bigots challenge your character to a fight for being different. So the joke is against prejudice, right? I guess. But you'll also encounter the PC principal, who proclaims the virtues of political correctness while exaggerating the importance of identity and labels to a near dogmatic level. There's even points in the combat where players are given a free hit if the enemy's comments can be viewed as a microaggression. And it's clear the PC principal is in the wrong, but this actually portrays any sort of cultural sensitivity as an impossibly high standard, which is totally at odds with all the identity-based sections. But okay, if that's going to be the game's philosophy, the idea that some people take PC culture too far, fine, fair enough. Let's see where the rest of the game goes. Well, a main plotline revolves around the corrupt police department rounding up dozens and dozens of innocent black citizens, an obvious nod to the increased awareness of police brutality towards people of color. But why is this happening in South Park? Because there's a monster in the police department that only eats African Americans. Put aside any personal beliefs, put aside any sort of moral convictions, and ask yourself, what is the joke? And I'm being serious here, I wasn't personally offended by anything in the game. And I like provocative humor. I like it when jokes cut right through the absurdity of modern life, challenging pre-established beliefs, even if it makes the audience uncomfortable. But still, the Fractured But Whole uses these touchy subjects like police brutality, gender identity, and political correctness as nothing more than references, and then dives into non-sequiturs. No different than, say, Barbra Streisand as a robot, or the island of Dr. Monroe with butts. Hey look, the South Park kids are dressed up like those superheroes. Whoa, Morgan Freeman has a taco shop. Fidget spinner, I know what that is. While the Stick of Truth used a traditional video game storyline format and escalated into absurdity, Fractured doesn't have a real theme or purpose to build on. Things just come and go with a mildly aggressive slant. The one major success is a brief side quest. Throughout the story, Tweek and Craig voice their dislike of each other. They used to date, they broke up, and now they're still fighting. In an effort to put aside their differences, they agree to counseling with Mr. Mackey, who's brought along some students to represent the elements of a toxic relationship. What starts as a fairly relaxed lesson in cooperation suddenly turns violent as Mr. Mackey demands Tweek and Craig brutally harm the visual aids. It's so abrupt and over the top, it's brilliant. It's a great joke. If only more of this was present in the main campaign. But by the end, the entire plot coils out of control with conspiracies, time travel, and split personalities. It's all rather abrupt and none of it pays off. If you're a fan of South Park, I imagine it's underwhelming. You're better off watching the show. And if you're new to the series, I'm not sure what you'll think, as the vast majority of jokes and story beats are callbacks to the 20-year-old canon. Even based off of Matt Stone and Trey Parker's other work, The Fractured But Whole is aimless. Strip away all the in-jokes and cultural references, and all you have is an average but simplistic RPG and a string of fart jokes.